Hello, everyone. My name is Lauren Antone, and I'm the Senior Marketing and Events Coordinator at MAR, as well as the producer of our free webinar series. Our webinar today is FEMA flood maps and how to submit for potential insurance premium reduction. This webinar will cover FEMA flood maps and the letters of map change that property owners can use to potentially change their flood insurance premiums. The discussion will include flood risk identification using online tools, basic flood insurance concepts, and letters of map change, also known as LOMAs and LOMRs. After our live session, the webinar will be recorded and added to our website at marealtor.com. If you have any questions throughout the session, please type them in the chat box on your screen and we'll hold a Q&A afterward. Our presenter today is Joy Duperault. Joy is Director of the Commonwealth's Flood Hazard Management Program, overseeing the implementation of the National Flood Insurance Program in coordination with Massachusetts' more than 340 NFIP communities. Joy is also the Deputy State Hazard Mitigation Officer, working with the Massachusetts Emergency Management Agency to implement federal disaster grant programs, as well as to integrate mitigation planning activities with local floodplain management practices. Joy was formerly the State NFIP Coordinator and Deputy Mitigation Officer for the state of Florida, where she resided for 40 years. Her work in emergency management began in the aftermath of Hurricane Charlie in 2004, and her background includes government and nonprofit work in the fields of environmental education and human services. Now, over to Joy.
Thank you, Lauren. All right, so welcome to this session, MAR session. I'm really happy to be able to speak with you today. I love speaking with realtors because to me, you are the folks on the front line. You're the ones that are dealing with people moving property around, if you will, in the floodplain. Transferring property, I guess, is the best way. So you need to have all the answers you can have about flood risk and about what people can expect with regard to insurance. And the ramifications of purchasing a property in the floodplain. So when we talk about the floodplain today, when I use the word floodplain, I'm going to be speaking specifically about the FEMA floodplain that has a 1% chance of flooding in any given year. So that's, we'll look at the maps and I'll explain that. And most of you probably know what that is anyway. So we'll start off with the flood insurance rate maps. I think most of you have seen these. We're going to talk about where to go and get a piece of the map, specifically the piece that contains the property that you're interested in, whether you're buying, someone's buying or selling, listing. These maps are updated as often as they can by FEMA, but Congress doesn't give them very much money every year, and they have to use that money for the whole entire country. So good or bad, we don't get them updated very often here in Massachusetts. The coastal areas do get a bit more attention than the inland areas, simply because there's a lot more development in the coastal areas. And so FEMA tends to spend the money where the development is taking place the most. Although a good note for those of you who are in the central or western parts of the Commonwealth, FEMA is updating those maps as we speak. It's a 5 to 7 year process. And for most of those in Western Mass right now, they're probably in about year 2 or year 3. So you will be getting some new maps 2, 3, 4 years from now in Central and Western Mass, which is long overdue because most of your maps are from the 70s and 80s, which is basically unacceptable, but that's the way it is. And so the maps, obviously being called the flood insurance rate maps, were created initially for flood insurance rating purposes. FEMA will be drifting away from that particular type of rating in the years to come, but that's another whole session. So I won't go into that today. But the way that the maps are set up, they are modeled for the flood that has a 1% chance in any given year of happening. Hopefully you can see my little arrow as I move it on the screen. For example, in this map here, this area out here is a VE zone. That means a velocity zone for which an elevation has been determined. And in this case, the elevation is 28 feet above sea level, which means that in that flood, that 1% chance flood, otherwise known as the 100-year flood, the water level can be expected to be as high as 28 feet above sea level. So you can see some of these homes that are right here along the edge of the coast. If their house is not 28 feet above sea level, they will be inundated. The maps, as I mentioned, FEMA doesn't get a lot of money. They've got to use the money judiciously, and so they don't really have a lot of money to go into great detail in every single place on the map. There are areas of the map where specific detailed studies were done, but there are other areas of the map where it's more of a broad brush stroke, and I'll be showing you as we go through. And so in those cases, sometimes for a specific parcel of land or a specific structure, the map can actually be wrong. And that's what we're going to talk about today, is when that is wrong, what do we do about it? So FEMA does have a process through which the maps can be challenged, and it's called the Letter of Map Change process. So you can find these maps, if you're not already familiar with this, at FEMA's Flood Map Service Center. You can find it by Googling FEMA Flood Map Service Center. But right here, I've given you the URL address for that. And as you can see, there's a field right near the top that you can enter a specific address and hit the search button, and it will take you to that spot on the FEMA flood map. Now, this is true for the entire nation. In the Commonwealth, if you're in the eastern part of the Commonwealth, you will be able to get to one kind of a map. And if you're in central or western Massachusetts, you'll be looking at another kind of a map. Today, for the sake of time, I'm not going to go into what those maps look like, but certainly I do offer that session as another part of a session, and I've given it through the MAR sessions before, and it's just called simply using the FEMA flood maps along with the Massachusetts GIS maps so that you can figure out what's really going on. But in general, this website is user-friendly. So if I refer in this presentation to the Map Service Center, this is the website that I'm referring to. The map that you'll be taken to when you put an address in is the current effective map at this time for that site. But the site does also contain historical maps. You could put an address in and find a historical map. And then also it contains folders that have files, that have documents that are the letters of map change that we're going to be talking about. So if there is an effective letter of map change available for a certain map panel, you'll be seeing where those folders are, and you can look at those. And also for, again, eastern, for the most eastern half of the state, you will be able to access the National Flood Hazard Layer. And in that site, I'll show you how to find specifically for a specific address whether or not there's a letter of map amendment associated with that site. So this is what the National Flood Hazard Layer looks like. When you go to the Map Service Center and put an address in, you will initially receive, it takes a minute or two to load, but you'll initially receive a picture of the FEMA flood insurance rate map. But there is an option, a button that says National Flood Hazard Layer, and if you click that button, you will get to see the bigger picture. It's the same kind of map, but it's just a little more usable. You can push it around and you can see other things. On this map, I chose to show you because all those little purple and red dots are where there are letters of map amendment. I don't really see any letters of map revision here, but LOMA stands for Letter of Map Amendment. If the dots are purple, then that means there's an active or effective letter of map amendment available for that site. If the dots are red, that means that there was a letter of map amendment at one time, but when the maps were updated, those letters were not revalidated. So it either means that the more detailed study in the updated map removed the letter of map amendment because it was no longer effective, or it just means that someone has not reapplied to reprove again they would have to reprove again with the new map that their letter is still effective. So they do revalidate all of the letters when they do a map update. So I guess what I want to say is the property owner doesn't have to do anything. So if we get a little closer, this is a part of Salem, as you can see. And in the National Flood Hazard Layer, you can right click on the little purple LOMA dot. And you can see this is a LOMA, a letter of map amendment for 52 and 54 Webb Street in the city of Salem. And you can see toward the bottom, at the very top left in the gray area, you can see this is page 1 of 6 for the file that is attached to that site in the National Flood Hazard Layer. So this is page 1, and on page 1 it says that this is a single lot, so probably a single family residence, or it could be a multifamily residence, but a single lot. And the structure, you'll see at the bottom, outcome. Structure has been removed from the floodplain. The property is partially inundated. And if you can see my little white arrow there, I'm guessing that the property is probably something like this in shape. And you can see that the flood hazard area does inundate part of the property, but not part of the structure, which is probably this dark area here. Very hard to see this here, but when you get into the Map Service Center, you can get a much closer look at these things. So part of the property is inundated by the velocity zone up to 14 feet above sea level, but the structure, according to FEMA now, with the letter of map amendment, is removed. So what this means is that if there's a mortgage on that structure, or if there's to be a mortgage on that structure, the lender would not have to follow the federal mandate to force a flood insurance policy on that structure. Now, that you might want to notice I said the lender would not have to enforce that federal mandate. Lenders can do what they want. So if the lender is not comfortable and thinks that that structure is too close to the floodplain, they could say, I'm sorry, we still are going to ask you to have a flood policy. And then possibly your buyer would want to look for another lender if the buyer really doesn't want to have a flood policy. The recommendation for something like this is that because the lender does not have to require a flood policy, and because FEMA has said that the structure is not in the floodplain, it's highly recommendable that the buyer would get a flood policy, but they would be able to get one at a much lower premium because of this letter of map amendment that says that the structure is not in the special flood hazard area. And so that's why a LOMA is so important sometimes when it is applicable. They're not always applicable. So this is a kind of complicated graphic. I don't really want to go into the whole thing about how the floodway is determined, but I do want to show you that the base flood elevation is really the most critical component of what we're talking about today. On a sunny day, you see this piece, this graphic showing this a lower part of the land here, and then it goes up on both sides. And this blue water here with this level indicated here, that's a sunny day. That's the level of the stream or the river on a sunny day. That is not the base flood elevation. That's just the sunny day level of the river, the height of the water. So what FEMA does is they will do a detailed study and run calculations or models to determine in that 1% chance flood or that 100-year flood, how high would that water go? How much water would get into that stream? And in this case, they've determined it would be this line here from A to B. So in a 1% chance flood, the water that's normally only this high would now be this high in that flood. So you can see that folks have a lot of trouble sometimes realizing when they're in the floodplain because their neighbors say, oh, it's never flooded here, or oh, my family's had this home for 60 years and they've never had a flood, and so forth and so on. And that may very well be true. But when FEMA uses their modeling to model that particular flood event, the 1% chance flood event, that's how deep the water is. So if, for example, there was a house right here, which in the case of some streams and floodplains could be, a quarter of a mile from this little stream, Nonetheless, in the 1% chance flood, a house right here would be flooded to this depth. So I just wanted you to be able to understand how critical it is to know what the base flood elevation is. Let's see if there's anything else here. Oh, there are some zones on the FEMA maps that are just called A zones. They're not AE. AE means an A zone with elevations that have been determined. But an A zone that has no elevations determined, that means there's been no base flood elevation calculated for that particular area. However, FEMA believes that there would be flooding there of some sort. So just bear that in mind as we go through some of these letters. So the most important thing to understand is that all of these little numbers indicated by these icons here are very important for someone to know if they're really going to determine the flood risk for their structure. So we don't know what the base flood elevation is on this particular site. This is just an example to show you. But what you do need to know is what is the lowest adjacent grade. Now, adjacent grade means the height of the land at the perimeter of the structure, all around the perimeter of the structure. So they're going to ask for the lowest adjacent grade where the structure meets the earth, and the highest adjacent grade where the structure meets the earth. So right here, C2F means lowest adjacent grade. So where this pier or pole comes down and meets the earth, obviously it's driven into the earth, but where the earth meets it on the outside, that's called the lowest adjacent grade. And here, C2G is the highest adjacent grade. In this case, it may be one and the same, but usually there's a little bit of difference. Land usually has a tiny bit at least of slope to it. They're also going to need to know in an A zone, which this is probably not because this is a V zone structure, but in A zone, C2A, what is the top of the lowest floor? And that includes a basement. So if there's a basement, the C2A, this number here, has to be the top of the basement floor, which in most cases will be well below the base flood elevation. They're also going to want to know if it is a V zone, which again, this looks like. They want to know what is the bottom of the lowest horizontal structure, because in a V zone, that is how the regulations measure the distance between the base flood elevation and the structure itself is the lowest, the bottom of the lowest horizontal structure. So that would be underneath the beam that holds the structure up. Also, what's critical is you notice an HVAC system sitting over here on the ground. This is an enlarged picture of it. C2E is where the surveyor would fill in what is the bottom of that mechanical or that equipment servicing the structure. So the bottom of the elevation, so it looks like this HVAC is on a slab of some sort. They're going to want to know the top of the slab, in actuality, the bottom of the mechanical itself. And then a couple of other things. They usually want to know where the stairs, if there's a deck, meet the ground. They usually want to know the grade at that point. And if there's a cantilevered deck, that's really critical too. Because if there's a deck that cantilevers off of the property and that deck itself reaches into the floodplain, then the entire structure is considered to be in the floodplain. Even if only one corner of that deck actually crosses the line, the entire structure is considered to be in. So that's just some notes for you. And certainly all of these things, if any of you have questions, we're going to have some questions at the end, but I'm available just day in and day out as a regular working person serving the Commonwealth for you to send an email to me about your questions and we can talk about those. So this is a portion of the FEMA elevation certificate. This is only section C. The elevation certificate is a couple pages long and also then has to be accompanied by quite a few photos. So but this section is where all this information from a surveyor would go if an elevation certificate is necessary. And we'll talk in a minute about where an elevation certificate would be necessary and where it would not be. So most of the time, my questions that I get are, oh my gosh, the lender says I have to have a flood insurance policy. The current owner, the seller, has never had to have one. How come I have to have one? How do I get out of it? How do I get out of having a policy forced onto me? So basically, to understand this is the lenders are required to have a determination made as to whether or not a structure is in the floodplain, because the federal law says that if you're lending money that has any federal investment in it, which is, again, 99.9% of all mortgages have some federal investment backing those mortgages, then the lender has to determine whether or not that structure is in the floodplain, because if it is, the lender has to require flood insurance. So lenders don't do that themselves. They're bankers. They're not floodplain people or engineers or surveyors. So they usually contract with a third-party determination company or a flood zone determination company. And so flood zone determination companies, basically, they get hundreds of these a day, and they basically pull up the FEMA map the same way you or I would do it on the map service center. They pull it up, they look at it, and they go, oh, there's floodplain on that property. Boom, you're in. And the lender then says to the buyer, you've got to have a policy. So I guess the thing to say on this particular slide is the flood zone determination firms, they do make mistakes, just like FEMA does on their maps. And there are two different things that a lender would have to have, either one or the other, a lender would have to have in order to say, oh, okay, that qualifies me to allow you to not have to have a flood insurance policy. One is, and both of them are official FEMA documentation. So one of them is the letter of map change or a reversal of the flood zone determination firm letter. And here are the steps for someone to go through to get that reversal. It's difficult to do this. The banker will not do it for you. And the flood zone determination companies are paid by the lenders, so they don't feel any obligation to you as a realtor or as a buyer of the property, or even as the seller. They don't feel an obligation to you. But if someone has the patience and the determination, they can follow these 4 steps to ask that the flood zone determination be re-examined. Usually I don't advise that for people because it's so sketchy. You've got to really persist like a bulldog to get them to change it. So that's why we're going to talk today about the other official FEMA documentation, and that is the letter of map change, showing the removal of the structure or the property from the floodplain. So these are the kinds of letter of map change. There's 5 different kinds we're going to talk about today. Primarily, we're going to talk about the first 2, because the first 2, any letter of map amendment is a homeowner or a property owner or a property owner can get this without cost. Let me back up, without paying a processing fee. The letter of map revision, et cetera, those are more technical. You have to have much more technical information, and there's a processing fee for those. So let's talk about the first 2, letter of map amendment, out as shown, and the regular letter of map amendment. And by the way, this is probably a good time for me to say that a letter of map amendment doesn't directly change the FEMA map. It's just sort of a note to the map, and it's attached to the map as a note. Oh, by the way, you know, here's the floodplain, but we found out that this structure is above the base flood. It's kind of a note like that. Letter of map revision literally changes the map itself. So you can see why it would require a lot more technical information. But they always require technical data to be submitted with the request. So for an out as shown, which we're going to talk about, it would require a copy of the FEMA format plus some deed and parcel documents. For a regular letter of map amendment, it will require an elevation certificate. For a letter of map revision or a LOMR, you would have to have some H&H work done by some engineers to show what the flood really does when it's calculated for that site. And then for any letter of map revision with fill, which would be the last 2, the community has to get involved and sign a form letting FEMA know certain things about that particular issue there. So right away, at the bottom in red, you can see if you don't know how to make a FEMA fermet, which I also teach in another session, you can Google how to make a FEMA fermet, and it will tell you the whole scoop there on how to get that. So this is a picture of a FEMA fermet, and you can see right in the center here, this little red marker. That is the FEMA mark. When we put in a certain address, you will get a little marker like that. The marker is not always specifically on the property. 9 times out of 10, the marker will show up wherever the the geocode location is for that address for either the fire or emergency management or the postal service. So in other words, it could be at the end of the driveway. It could be at the corner of the property if it's on a, if it's on a corner of 2 streets. So I guess what I'm trying to let you know is the marker does not indicate the building itself or anything particular like that. It's just an indication of the geocode for that parcel. So the parcel could be this big. It could be just like that. And it could have some floodway on this part, and it could have some of this 500-year floodplain over here. Oh, in case I didn't tell you, the blue is the 1% chance floodplain, and the orange is the 0.2% chance floodplain. So the 1% chance floodplain again is the flood event that has a 1% chance of occurring in any given year. This orange or 500-year floodplain has a 0.2% chance of occurring in any given year. So this is far less likely to occur. This is not the regulated floodplain, only the blue, which includes this floodway. That's blue also. Okay, so you can see this little marker is not in the 500-year floodplain, it's not in the 1% chance floodplain, and it's not in the floodway. Although some of those may be on the property, so that's where you have to find out where is the property actually and where is the structure. But in this case, you would say to whoever you're working with, gee, it looks like your property might be out of the floodplain as shown on the FEMA map. So there's a possibility that that structure, wherever it is not in the floodplain, just basically by looking at the map. So this is why, if that's the case, you don't need an elevation certificate to file for an out as shown LOMA. So this is part of the form. It's a 3-page form. You can get it online. Matter of fact, if you Google this, you'll get it. But you can Google FEMA MTZ. You can Google FEMA out as shown. Sooner or later, you'll get to the FEMA website with the form. And so you will need the fermet from the FEMA Map Service Center that clearly shows the property, at least the structure, out of the floodplain. You'll need a copy of the subdivision plat map or a copy of the property deed, the part of the deed that shows the lot and block and township number and so forth. They'll need a locator map, which they can draw, or they can, get that pretty easily through Google Maps. A map showing the parcel outlined, showing the streets, and also has to have a north arrow on the map. And then all of those documents with this form can be submitted to FEMA. There's no cost. And if FEMA looks at all that and says, wow, they're right, they're out of the floodplain, then you'll get a document from FEMA that you can show to the lender. One of my recommendations for out as shown, since this is the same form that people file for a LOMA, I recommend that you write out as shown in a bright color on the form on every page, out as shown, because sometimes people will submit these without doing that, and then FEMA wants to know where is the elevation certificate because they didn't notice that this is an out as shown request. So this is a portion of the documentation that the person would receive. Up at the top, you see it says letter of map amendment, determination document, out as shown. And then down here under the determination section, the address and the outcome, what is outside of the special flood hazard area. In this case, it's the structure, which happens to be a residence. And where is it? It's in flood zone X. So there's no base flood elevation associated with the X zone. And so this whole document, which is usually a couple of pages long, is what would be brought to the lender. And the lender could then say, okay, you've just released me from the mandate to require flood insurance. It could be that simple. All right, so now we get back to a regular letter of map amendment where it isn't out as shown, but it's still higher than the base flood elevation. So you can see here's two LOMAs down here on the map. Here's one over here, here's one over here. Now these two, this one and this one, they could have been an out as shown because again, here this striped area is the floodway. The blue is the 1% chance floodplain, including the floodway. And then the orange is the 500-year floodplain. And this property may well be out as shown, as is possibly this property. But these two don't look like they're out of the floodplain at all. As a matter of fact, this one looks like it's actually in the floodway. So then how is it that it might be higher than the base flood elevation? Again, when FEMA maps, they do a broad brush. They say, okay, here's the floodway, whoosh, down there. Here's the 1%, 500, and they move on. They don't look at every knoll and bump and land irregularity that might actually be higher than the base flood. They just can't do that. There would be holes in this floodplain all over the place if they could do that, but it's way too expensive. And so that leaves it up to the property owner to have to prove to FEMA that, hey, wait a minute, you say the base flood elevation here is, let's just pull a number out of the air, 400 feet above sea level. But there's actually a little bit of a hill right here, and my house is on top of it, and I'm actually 415 feet above sea level. So in that case, that owner would want to apply for a letter of map amendment. What they are going to need is an elevation certificate. So whether the seller has an elevation certificate already, or whether the buyer needs to acquire one, either by asking the seller to get one as a part of the process for negotiations, or whether the buyer gets one themselves. But in any case, if there's a transaction on this property and an elevation certificate and a LOMA determination has not been made before the date of the closing, then the lender will have to require that flood insurance policy on the date of the closing. And then if a LOMA is acquired afterwards, then the policy can be refunded within certain limits. I'm not a flood insurance expert, but I know that that can happen. So this is typically used for a single family residence or a townhouse or a small commercial property. It's not typically used for large enterprises like a new Walmart or something. Those would be letters of map revision, not a LOMA. And also the LOMA, again, no cost to apply. You apply online with the MTEZ form and your documents. And within a few weeks, you should be able to get the results if FEMA has all the documentation they need. Sometimes people don't submit all of it, and then FEMA will say, gee, we need this or that. And so then once you submit this or that, then the clock starts ticking again for the couple of weeks that it takes them to review these. But let's look at what would happen if this property is considered to be out. So again, here's a sample of the determination at the top. Of course, it would say letter of map amendment, determination document, and in this case, it would say removal, because here you see what is removed from the special flood hazard area. It's the structure at 10 Lafayette Street. Why? The structure is in the X zone. The base flood elevation, remember, let's go back for a second. Remember, the property could be right here. And so there is a base flood elevation there, okay? But that base flood elevation is 6.8 feet, and yet the lowest adjacent grade on that property, the lowest adjacent grade to the structure, is 2.5 feet above the base flood elevation. And so, therefore, the structure is removed from the floodplain because it is higher than the base flood elevation, okay? This gets a little difficult in conversation sometimes only because you don't want your buyer or your seller, whoever you're working with, to think that you're completely out of the floodplain. You're not out of the floodplain, but your structure is out of the floodplain, okay? So, but because of this, because the structure is removed, the lender can feel that they have now been relieved of that obligation for the flood insurance policy. But now here's one where it's not removed. Letter of map amendment up here at the top, determination document, non-removal, right here in big letters, and then determination, outcome. What is not removed from the special flood hazard area? The structure or residence at 8 Water Street. Why? Because it's in flood zone AE, it has a base flood elevation of 13 feet, but the lowest adjacent grade to the structure is below 13 feet. So FEMA was not able to say you are above the floodplain because they're not. And they always go with the lowest adjacent grade next to the structure. They don't care what the highest adjacent grade is. Okay, let's go a little more quickly because I want to make sure we have time for questions. Letter of map revision, typically you probably won't get involved with this. Again, it's where the floodplain itself, whatever the developer is doing, they are literally changing the floodplain. So that means typically they're putting in fill, or they're changing a culvert, or they are moving part of the land around to alter the water course. So all of those are highly technical issues. There are certain things they are not allowed to do, certain things they can do. But I just wanted to show you that a letter of map revision, the part of the documentation that would be received for the LOMR is it would show you the map, and it would show you in a dark line like this, the area of the map that was revised. And then you would have to read through all the technical documents to see how and why it was revised and why it was approved. This is a much more technical process. There is another form, MT1 form. There is a fee to apply, and the fees differ depending on what it is that's being done. It's much longer review time. Instead of 1 or 2 weeks, it's probably more like 4 to 6 weeks. And if you're working with an actual engineer, they can file this through FEMA's website. A non-engineer person has to file it through paper, but not through the website. So that's a letter of map revision. A letter of map revision based on fill. Obviously, fill is going on the property. The community has to approve it, so your conservation commission would have to approve that. And then there's much more rigorous review here when there's fill in the floodplain. But if someone gets a letter of map revision based on fill, a LOMR F, then that could be used also to remove the mandatory flood insurance purchase requirement. I want to just show you one thing that this is the community acknowledgement form that community has to sign when fill is being placed in a floodplain. And many communities have a prohibition and say no fill can be placed in our floodplain. So in many communities, this isn't even a conversation. This is what I really wanted to show you here, just to have you be aware. If you're working with new construction, many times people want to come into a floodplain, they want to put in the fill and then put a house with a basement on it. If that's allowed in the community, because number one, the community would have to allow this, what they need to know, the developer, the potential owner needs to know is that sometimes FEMA will approve the placement of the fill, but they will not approve the placement of a basement. And that can get really sticky because the FEMA process is not clear about that. So if someone is placing fill in a floodplain to quote unquote lift the land up out of the floodplain, but then they want to put a basement in near the floodplain, you just want to make sure that everybody has their ducks in a row about whether that's really going to be allowed or not. Okay, where to find letters of map change on the Map Service Center. Again, if you go to, and anybody can do this, whether you're in Eastern Mass or Western Mass, go to the Map Service Center and put in your address, and there will be folders. When you put in an address, the Map Service Center will pull up part of a map panel, and for any letters of map change on that panel, there will be folders. You'll see them. They look like this right here. So changes to this firm, meaning this panel. Are there revisions? Yes, there are 3 letters of map revision. There are 20 letters of map amendments, and 1 is probably a letter of map amendment that's been revalidated since FEMA updated the maps. So you would look in here, if you click on any one of these folders, here, if you click on amendments, for example, the folder will open and there will be 20 different documents there. You cannot find the document by address because they don't have the address on them. They just have the case number on them. And so it's very difficult. But if you're fortunate to be in a part of the state where you can click this button right here that says go to the NFHL viewer, then you get this, the NFHL viewer, and you can put the address in up in this corner, and a dot will come up, and you can right click on the dot, and if there are any documents associated with that dot, they will show up. Now here, it just says search result, and it doesn't say pages 1 of 6 or 1 of 9. It says nothing. So there's no document associated with that dot right there. But if there were, it would give you a document similar to the one I showed you towards the beginning that showed that there was a letter of map amendment out as shown or whatever it was. Okay, so if you're looking specifically for an address to see if there's a LOMA or a LOMA associated with it, you would go to the National Flood Hazard Layer in the FEMA Map Service Center and put an address in here. For communities in Western Mass that don't have the National Flood Hazard Layer, you have to go this way, and you would have to look at all of these amendments to see. The other thing is you can pull up the letters of map revision or letters of map amendment on the map itself and see if there are any in the neighborhood, because they would show up again as those little purple or red numbers. And if there are, you could click on those numbers and then you could see. So it's not all doom and gloom in Western Mass. So I'm getting ready to end here, and what my advice to you is, this is my advice regarding your advice to your client. Don't proclaim knowledge about something if you're not absolutely certain about it. So you can refer them to folks rather than proclaiming knowledge. You can refer them to the FEMA Map Service Center. Actually, the FEMA Map Service Center has staff that answer their phone and their emails. They're very helpful. And down here, I give you the phone number for that. If you're in the Map Service Center, there's a place where it says contact MSC staff, and they'll give you this phone number. It'll also give you an email address. So you can refer them. If they have questions specifically about the flood insurance policy, you can refer them to this fellow here, Tom Young. He is the FEMA flood insurance expert for FEMA Region 1. In which the Commonwealth resides, and there's his phone number and his email address. He does not sell flood insurance. He is merely a flood insurance expert there to answer questions, specifically to answer questions for folks. You can help them look up their files on the Map Service Center and see if there's any letters of map change for their neighbors, because if their neighbors have letters of map change showing on the MSC website, then it's possible they might be able to get one too. Also, before you have anybody do anything, check with their insurance agent to get a quote, because if they go and spend $1,000 on an elevation certificate and it wasn't really going to make any difference, the insurance agent might know that, and then they would just as well not spend that money. So these are kinds of my advice to you. If someone is looking for a certified surveyor and they have no idea where to start, the Massachusetts Association of Land Surveyors and Civil Engineers has a website, malsi.org. And if you go to that website, in the top right-hand corner, there's a little thing that says, look for a surveyor. And all the surveyors in the Commonwealth who are certified and who are members of MALSI, they are listed there. And so you could help your client find an engineer there or a surveyor there. So that's it. I'm 1 minute short of my time to get ready for questions for you. So that's my contact information, and my colleague Eric Carlson, he can also answer questions. Neither of us, by the way, are at those desk phone numbers right now. We're both teleworking through the COVID pandemic. But if you email us, we can certainly set up a call with you if you want. I'm happy to come and do a presentation, well, come online and do a presentation for your realtor association in your area. And also you can refer your clients to us and we can help them figure some things out too. So thank you for your time. And Lauren, if there are any questions, I'm ready.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Joy. That was a great presentation. I think, it looked like the attendees were very attentive. So if you have any questions, now is the time to write them in your chat box. It looks like we have got a few questions already. So the first one is, does it require a new survey to revalidate if it expires?
Very good question. That's an excellent question. On the elevation certificate, up in the top right-hand corner on page 1, there is a date of expiration. That date is an expiration date for the form only. It is not an expiration date for the content of the form once the form has been used. So an elevation certificate is always good for that structure as long as nothing has changed, like the structure hasn't been changed, or the land hasn't suddenly eroded away. So as long as nothing has changed, that elevation certificate is good for that structure, for the life of the structure, as long as, again, nothing has changed. So basically, if you have a seller who has an elevation certificate, it's really in the best interest for that seller to give that elevation certificate to the buyer, because once the seller leaves that address, they have absolutely no use for that elevation certificate. It doesn't go with the person, it stays with the building.
Great. So the next question is, if the heating system is at the living level, not in a basement, how does that affect things?
So that's a really good question too. The less things that you have in your basement could impact your premium, especially with regard to mechanicals that service the building. So if you have a basement, it has a boiler down there and, washer and dryer and all kinds of other things, especially the mechanicals that service the building. That when you get your flood insurance policy, the policy premium is affected by the fact that those things are down there. If you take them out, your premium could be less, but it might not be less. And that's where the extent of my knowledge ends. At that point, I call Tom Young and I say, hey, tell me, if these people take this out of here, is it going to make their policy lower? So that's a Tom Young answer, but I do know that having a basement does make your policy quite a bit more expensive, just even having the basement, even if it's empty.
Can you give us a definition of what each flood zone means, A, B, C, V, X?
Sure thing. So an A zone is the 1% chance flood. In other words, again, the flood that would be estimated to have a 1% chance in any given year of occurring. By the way, with climate change and so forth, the 1% chance flood is occurring much, much more often. And so ultimately down the road, we're going to have to probably redefine that. So that's the A zone. Those are shown in blue on the maps in Eastern Mass, and in the maps in Western Mass, those are shown as a shaded area on the map. Then just outside of that is the 500-year floodplain. So that's not an A or a V or anything, but that used to be called the shaded X zone. It used to be called Zone B. So if you're looking at an old map and it has a B like boy, that could be the 500-year floodplain. V stands for velocity, so you're only going to have a V zone in Massachusetts in the coastal areas. They also exist around the Great Lakes, but for Massachusetts, you'll only find the V zones in Eastern Mass right along the coast, because that's the velocity of the waves coming in. So if it says V for velocity, that's the highest risk area. So you have V, A, and then there are various kinds of A's like AR and so forth that have to do with work being done on a dam or a levee. That gets a little more complicated. But again, all of these letters are for FEMA flood insurance rating purposes at this point in time. I hope that, X, I'm sorry. X is FEMA's way of saying, we haven't calculated a floodplain here. So that's your lowest risk area where the X is, and it is considered to not be in the floodplain. Although FEMA tells people all the time, if it rains on your house, you're in a floodplain. But then that's just because that helps them sell the policies, I guess.
Great. The next question is, how can we search if a home has an elevation certificate on file?
That is also an excellent question. You cannot search in Massachusetts for that because the Commonwealth hasn't set something up like that. Some other states have. So in the Commonwealth, there are 22 communities. So let me back up. There's 351 communities in Massachusetts. 341 of them participate in the National Flood Insurance Program. 22 of them that do participate at a higher level. And so they are considered exemplary communities. We call those community rating system communities. There are 22 of them. In those communities, an elevation certificate is required for new construction. So if you are looking for something in those communities that's been constructed in the last, let's say, 10 years, the likelihood of getting an elevation certificate is very good. And in those cases, you would go to the building department or the Conservation Commission to see who has that in their file, okay? If you're not in a community rating system community, then the elevation certificate is not required to be used, and the likelihood of someone having one is pretty slim. And also, if a homeowner has gone ahead and gotten an elevation certificate on their own, maybe to reduce their flood insurance premium or to get out of paying altogether, many times those folks don't file those elevation certificates anywhere. So only the homeowner themselves would know that they have it. On the other hand, you could also check with the insurance agent, because if an elevation certificate is used to rate an insurance policy, then the insurance agent would have to check that in their system that they had an elevation certificate. So you could ask the insurance agent, was this rated with an elevation certificate? And if they say yes, then they may have a copy in their folder, or the homeowner may have it somewhere that they remember where it is. If they got it, 10 years ago, who knows? But that's a very good question. And if someone wants to know whether or not they are in a CRS community, they can Google CRS communities in Massachusetts, and I think that will bring them up a list. Or they can email me and I'll send them the list of communities.
So next question is, what is the typical cost of flood insurance in a $500,000 house?
Okay, so a $500,000 house, let me just say, for residential policies, FEMA will only allow you to insure up to $250,000 on the building and up to $100,000 on the contents. So the most you could ever get if that house was completely flattened and everything washed away is $350,000. Let me step back and say that in Massachusetts, if you take all of the policies in Massachusetts, the coastal high-risk policies and the inland low-risk policies, wherever they are, doesn't have to be necessarily inland, the average premium that a policyholder pays every year in Massachusetts is $1,200. So policies can range from as low as, they say, $400 or $500 for a preferred rate policy in an X zone. I've never seen a policy that low in Massachusetts. Usually they're more like around $700 or $800 a year for preferred risk, but they say that they can get as low as $400 or $500. It must be a really low amount of coverage with maybe a high deductible, I don't know. So you can pay as low as that, but some people on the coast pay as much as $12,000 or $13,000 or $14,000 a year or more. And if your home is worth more than the maximum coverage that you can get under the NFIP, your lender may require you to get that additional coverage through a surplus lines company, if there's a lender.
Is the lower level of a raised ranch considered to be a basement level?
So I'm not sure what raised ranch means, but if it's, I think, yeah.
Yeah,
I think
their
those.
first floor is like partially underground.
Yeah, okay. So the definition of a basement in the Massachusetts Building Code is a floor that is below grade on all four sides. And it's pretty much that simple. If that floor is below grade on all four sides, in other words, if you're standing on that floor and you have to walk up some steps to get out, then that's considered a basement. I know that some people have a slab house, but they've got a sunken living room. That's considered a basement because that sunken living room is below grade on all four sides. It's crazy, but the policy is rated that way too. So if it's a walkout where it's below grade on three sides, but you can walk straight out of that thing without going up a stair on one side, that's not a basement.
Okay, that makes sense. So where can I see if a home has a history of flooding or has had previous storm damage?
And that's another excellent question. And that's another presentation that I make called Buying and Selling in the Floodplain. That's a very difficult thing to get. FEMA, claims that they're headed towards transparency. Every year they claim that, but they still will not allow anyone to see those records except for the homeowner policyholder themselves. So if you have a homeowner who's a policyholder, then they can get that flood information themselves for their own structure. They're the only one who can get it. If you really want to know that, email me because there's a phone number they can call. I think it's the NFIP Flood Loss Helpline. I'm not sure. You could Google it. But the homeowner alone, who is the policyholder, is the only one who can call. They have to verify on the phone some information about themselves and their policy and so forth. And then that record is sent to them. I used to be able to see it, but FEMA a year and a half ago changed all of their databases and they shut all of us out because of the 1974 Privacy Act, saying that that information is protected under the Privacy Act. So I can't even see it anymore.
What are the zones along the RHE Merrimack River?
So RHE does not sound at all like anything you would find on a FEMA map. I'm not sure what RHE is. The Merrimack would have V zones in the mouth of the Merrimack in that area, say Newburyport, Salisbury area. But if you move further up the river, there would be A zones, only A zones. If someone has a specific question like that, maybe they can shoot a picture of something and email it to me and I can talk to them about it.
A building in a flood zone has 3 units with 1 basement. Does each unit, floors 1 through 3, in the building have to be insured for $250,000? What if 2 or 3 units have no mortgage?
That's a really great question, and I'm going to give you a quick answer because that's really beyond my ken. But I know that, so if it's not a condominium, because condominiums have a different kind of policy altogether, that's called an RC BAP policy, where the condominium association will insure the building, and then each individual unit will insure their contents to the studs of the building. As far as like a townhouse, a 3-unit townhouse, I think, and do not quote me on this, that if there's a mortgage on one of them and it's in the floodplain, they would have to have a policy. I don't think the other two would have to have a policy, but I don't know. That is definitely a question for Tom Young, definitely. He knows all of those answers.
Great. Well, that looks like that's all the questions for today. As a reminder to everyone, this webinar has been recorded and will be available in the next few days on our website. Thank you so much, Joy, for your presentation. Everybody had great things to say. And thank you to everyone for joining today. We hope to see you next time.